I'd like to continue our discussion of Jacques-Louis David with the dead Marat. As you remember last time, I was talking about the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, how it increasingly radicalized in 1790, 1791. And then in 1792, the monarchy was abolished. The king and queen were arrested along with other members of the royal family, and in 1793, they were executed. This period from late 1792 into 1794 was the period of the ascendancy of the Jacobin Party. The party was called Jacobins because they met in an old monastery that had been secularized, dedicated to St. Jacobus, St. James, and so that's where they took the name of Jacobin. Jacques-Louis David, in addition to being a very important, probably the most important painter in the French school, was also a radical politician during these days of the Jacobin ascendancy, also known as the Terror. He was on the Committee of General Security. The revolutionary government in Paris was run by a series of committees, and General Security was in charge of the vast spy network throughout the country, trying to root out counter-revolutionaries and people who were, supported the monarchy and the church and those sorts of things. By the way, the Roman Catholic Church was abolished in France during this time. David's name is on the death warrants of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and a whole bunch of other people who were condemned to death by these revolutionary tribunals. As I mentioned last time also, Jean-Paul Marat, who we see here dead in his bathtub, was a leading Jacobin journalist. He used his paper called The Friend of the People, L'Ami du Peuple, to denounce enemies, counter-revolutionaries, and also people he just happened not to like. The event took place, and this was very well documented, the event took place at his house. A moderate revolutionary who did not like the direction the Jacobins were taking the revolution, her name was Charlotte Corday, and she's the subject of the Gelbert article that I asked you to read, The Blonding of Charlotte Corday. She was from a town in northwestern France. She read about Marat and thought he was a pig, which of course he was, and other things, and she decided that she would kill him for the good of the revolution. Anyway, she bought a coach ticket to Paris. She got off her stagecoach. She went to a shop and bought a butcher knife that we see bloodied here in the lower part of the left-hand side of the picture. Here's the blade, here's the handle, and here's some blood on the blade end here. She then went to Marat's house. She knew she wouldn't be able to get in unless she had something that he wanted. So she sent him a note saying that she wanted to denounce counter-revolutionaries back in her hometown. It's up in Arras, as I said, in northwestern France. She wrote the letter, she had it sent in, and when he got the letter, he said, "We'll send her in." Marat had a terrible skin condition, as I mentioned last time, so he worked in a medicinal bath that soothed the sores on his skin, and we see him in his bathtub here. It's very carefully camouflaged by David, who doesn't want to emphasize that particular part of Marat's profile. Anyway, she came in, Marat read the letter, and while he was in the bathtub, she stabbed him. She did not attempt to flee or run away or deny that she had done it. She was very proud that she had done it. She was immediately arrested, put on trial, and then shortly after that was executed. David's portrait of the dead Marat may purport to be a documentary account of the event, but in point of fact, it really is not at all. He uses several strategies here, pictorially speaking, in order to emphasize Marat's sanctity, that is, in a secular revolutionary sense. In order to have a scene that would communicate this kind of devotion to the revolution and willingness to die for it, David drew on older traditions of the martyrdom of Christian saints. That is, he gives them a certain sense of nobility, he surrounds them with attributes that become relics in the Christian sense, and he also, in the upper half of the composition here, leaves it almost completely blank. It's sketched in. In a Christian martyrdom, one would expect to see, Jesus hanging out on a cloud or some cherubs coming in with palm fronds, a traditional symbol of martyrdom, and all of that. But David does not give us anything like that. He indicates here that there is no afterlife. The only afterlife is in the sense of Marat's memory and his devotion to the revolution. David painted the picture gratis, that is for free, and it was hung behind the tribunal in the Revolutionary Assembly, where the laws of the Revolution and the Jacobins in particular were being made. It was a reminder to all the people there that the Revolution, there was no turning back. They had abolished the monarchy, the king and queen were dead, and that there was only one way forward, and that this may be the price that one had to pay. Later, in the 1793 and 94, David painted two other pictures of these so-called revolutionary martyrs, but the Marat is by far the most famous one. Charlotte Corday is notably absent here because the Jacobins in particular did not like women politicians or women being involved in public affairs or public life. To the radical revolution, the left-wing elements, women's role was to create sons and daughters for the revolution. That is, to bear children and attend houses and to keep their mouths shut and stay at home. Charlotte Corday then, as an agent of political action, a woman who absolutely acted and effected radical political change by murdering Marat, simply couldn't be tolerated in the scene. So she's completely absent from it. And the only indication that David gives us about this is the letter that you see here that Charlotte Corday handed him in order to get access to him. You can see that it's blood-stained. If you read the text of the letter, you'll see that she uses very fancy French pluperfect and other kinds of literary tenses. This is not what the letter said at all. The letter survives. It's in the Archives Nationales in Paris. The letter is very simple and direct. But by using this kind of flowery language, David is trying to paint her as an aristocratic reactionary monarchist, when in point of fact, she was a moderate revolutionary who didn't like the radicalization that David, Marat, and particularly Maximilien Robespierre, who was on the key terms list last time, who was the head of the Jacobin Party. He was beheaded in 1794. So the letter itself is a fiction. It's basically a ploy to try to make Charlotte Corday into something that's very anti-revolutionary, when in point of fact, that's not the case. The other letter that we see on his desk here, with some of the French Revolutionary paper money that we see here as well, is a note to Marat from a war widow. By 1792, everybody in Europe is at war with revolutionary France, and a war widow sent Marat an appeal for some state support. He sent her some money as a virtuous widow whose husband had died in the cause and who left behind a wife and orphaned children. That little wad of paper on top of it, these are called assignats. You don't have to know that, but that's the name of the French Revolutionary currency, indicate that he's just getting ready to, when Corday came in to kill him, he was just getting ready to write her a letter and to send her some money to help support her. So the noble Marat helping the poor war widow, again, a piece of kind of martyrological propaganda. He holds the quill pen in his right hand. In other words, he's even in death, he is writing in support of the revolution, fighting for the revolution and the just cause and all of that. You can see the wound in the upper right part of his chest. It's a little bit bloody, but it's interesting how little horror and little gore is actually represented here. According to eyewitnesses, David, by the way, when he heard the news, went rushing over to Marat's house to see and to make a sketch of the head, which he did almost immediately. This happened in July, and it was hot, and he was rotten anyway, even alive, so they had to do something very, very quickly because he began to deteriorate, and that's why David was so anxious to get over to sketch the particular scene. Anyway, the wound itself recalls the wound in the side of Christ, who a Roman centurion stuck a spear into his side, to make sure he was dead, and sort of both water and both wine and blood flowed from it. This is, of course, has a Christian significance in symbolism. Here it's simply sort of a reminder of what martyrdom really is, and it's almost making Marat into this secular Christ, this sort of person dying in the good cause. Dead Marat, then, is basically a picture that in many ways emblematizes the revolution itself, particularly the radical phase of the revolution from 1792 to 1794. The intensity of the expression, the strong contrast of light and shadow, By the way, remember, David was in Rome for 5 years in the late 1770s and early 1780s, and he even went back to Rome for about a year to paint the Oath of the Horatii, as I mentioned last time. He was one of the few artists of his generation who was profoundly influenced by Caravaggio and by the tenebrism and chiaroscuro that Caravaggio employed to create drama and a sense, in some ways, a sense of mystery in his pictures. Here it's done more as a form of theatrical spotlight. It's almost as if we're looking at this scene reenacted on a stage with spotlights showing us the hero and all of this. But ultimately, this picture is also about the idea of a monument, monumentos, which comes from the Greek word ultimately for memory, mnemosyne. In other words, what we're looking at here is not the hope of Marat's resurrection and hanging out in heaven or whatever. There is a hell. I'm sure he's roasting in it right now. But it's the idea that a person's deeds, a person in their life, when they die, the only immortality is in their memory. And in this sense, David won, because we definitely remember Marat, who otherwise is a fairly forgettable type of character, but he's become the symbol of Jacobin radicalism and dying for the revolutionary cause. Okay, I'd like to move forward in time. As I mentioned, Marat was killed in murdered in 1793. This was the really radical phase of the revolution. It's the same year that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and Louis' sister Elizabeth and a lot of other members of the royal family, the aristocracy, and just a lot of common people were executed during the Jacobin period. These are the days of Madame Guillotine. If you've read Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, as many people did in high school, I was one of those. This is exactly about this moment of revolutionary terror in the 1793 and 1794. By the middle of 1794, people were tired of the bloodletting. No one felt safe. There was a coup, and Robespierre and the Jacobins were overthrown. David was arrested as a leading member of the Committee of General Security and a sort of high-ranking Jacobin political functionary. Robespierre and about 36 of his associates all went to the guillotine on one day in the middle of July of 1794. David would have been executed with them, absolutely. The only thing that saved him was his reputation as a great artist, and it was thought that to kill David would almost be an attack on art and culture. So he was kept in prison for over 2 years and was closely watched. Anytime there was a plot from 1794 to 1800, when everything changed, as we'll see in a moment, anytime there was a plot to sort of reestablish the terror, reestablish committee government along the Jacobin model, David would be rearrested and put back in jail for a while. During this period of the mid and late 1790s, David painted exclusively portraits, usually society portraits. These were lucrative. He could make money doing this, but they were also politically safe. They didn't have the kind of sort of political associations. He avoided portraits of leading political figures during this period, though he sometimes painted their mistresses. And women are always safer portrait subjects than men. Anyway, but in 1800 something happened that not only changed the history of France, the history of Europe, and just sort of modern history generally. It also changed David's career trajectory. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte, a French military officer, young, from the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean, staged a coup with help of his brother, and they took over the French government. In 1800, it became a military dictatorship that Napoleon called the Consulate. This is a deliberate reference back to ancient Rome, because in ancient Rome, in the days of the Republic, see, France is a republic after the abolition of the monarch in 1792. So Napoleon, at least for a time, wanted to maintain the fiction of the Republic. So he uses this old ancient Roman term associated with the Republic, consulate. In ancient Rome, there were always two consuls in the Senate, one senior and one junior. Napoleon set up himself as first consul and then two lackeys, yes men, who wouldn't challenge him at all, as other members of this consulate. The consulate existed from 1800 to 1804. By 1804, Napoleon's military victories, the expansion of France throughout most of Western and Central Europe, they by this time had conquered much of northern Italy, Switzerland, all the Low Countries, parts of Germany. Spain was basically in alliance with France, but very much as almost a type of vassal state. The only resistance was really coming from the British and from the Portuguese. Anyway, he felt secure enough to reestablish hereditary aristocracy and a hereditary form of dynastic government. In 1804, he proclaimed the French Empire, with himself as emperor. Not as emperor of France, but as emperor of the French, to emphasize his connection to the people and that this was somehow the popular will that he become emperor. The empire lasted from 1804 to 1810. In 1812, the year this picture was painted, Napoleon in his study, Napoleon declared war on Russia, which was a big mistake. Russia's basically too big to conquer, but Napoleon's ego was even bigger than Russia. He marched in with 675,000 troops. He even occupied Moscow, but the Russians wouldn't surrender. They simply retreated further in. And they set the city of Moscow on fire. If you've ever read the novel War and Peace, and if you haven't, no person is really educated until they've read it. This is about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, the burning of Moscow, and how it affected lives of individual characters created by Leo Tolstoy. The retreat from Russia was horrible. The winter set in early that year, it was in October, and thousands and thousands and thousands of French soldiers died. As I mentioned, he went in with 675,000, fewer than 100,000 came out, so his army was destroyed. This was the beginning of the end of the empire. In 1812 and 1813, he retreated across Europe, going west, and in 1814, Paris was occupied and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He came back very briefly for about 3.5 months in 1815, but was definitively defeated in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, Fini Empire. This picture, though, was painted in 1812, the year of the disastrous Russian campaign, was actually commissioned by a Scottish collector who was an admirer of Napoleon. Not the Emperor Napoleon, he was an admirer of Napoleon during the consulate, because the consulate did have some other military adventure, and dictatorship was part of it, but there were some solid achievements, lasting achievements in France during the consulate. One of these was the composition of the Code Napoleon, which is the first item on the key terms list. I think it appeared last time as well. This is the Napoleonic Law Code, a commission that had met for over 2 years with Napoleon closely following its process, had completely redefined traditional French law. French law was in many ways still medieval in the opening of the 19th century. There were different law courts, different sorts of civil juridical bodies and different bodies of law all over the country depending on where you were. For instance, in Bordeaux, something that was illegal could be legal in Marseille, or illegal in Paris but legal in Dijon. In other words, the Code Napoleon took all these laws, swept them away, and created a uniform law code for the country. In this country, one of the lasting achievements of the Code Napoleon was in Louisiana law. Louisiana law is still largely based on the Code Napoleon, and if you're a lawyer and you want to practice in Louisiana, your bar exam is very, very different than it is in the other 49 states because of this Napoleonic legacy. In terms of gender, though, the Code Napoleon was kind of a disaster. It severely limited the rights of women to inherit property, to administer the estates of deceased husbands or deceased fathers. It basically created a kind of a second rank of citizenship for women. This was also true in divorce. Women were not allowed to bring action for divorce. Only men could do that. So no matter how battered a wife would be or how unfaithful her husband was, unless he decided on a divorce, she was helpless, at least legally speaking. You see in this picture of Napoleon in his study that he's been working all night long. If you look at the big clock here, you can see, excuse me, That is 12 minutes after 4 o'clock in the morning. In other words, he's been up all night. The reason we know this is not the afternoon is because the candle here has almost burned completely down. He's been sitting, look at the wrinkles in his silk stockings and around his legs. In other words, he's been in the chair working very hard. And here's one of the volumes, and it's labeled Code, Napoleon, right here under his desk. The furniture here is a good example of empire furniture from the 1804 to 1814 period. This gold gilt chair with the red velvet upholstery. We see bees here. These are not the Barberini bees that we talked about with the Baldacchino by Bernini, but the bee in antiquity is a symbol of activity. That is sort of positive type of activity. You work hard, you make honey. Metaphorically, that's what Napoleon has achieved here with the Code. This table here that has the lion's head and coming down into one foot here, also upholstered in red velvet with a blue fringed velvet cover cloth for it. This is also a very good example of empire furniture. Everybody always asks about the gesture of Napoleon putting his hand into his vest. This is not just Napoleon. This was a common male affectation of upper class men during this period. He might have lice. I mean, who knows if he has lice or not. Some people have suggested this, but I don't think that's the case at all. It's simply one way of basically sort of pushing in your stomach. And by this time, Napoleon was getting, as you see, pretty chubby, and his hair was beginning to recede. In earlier periods, especially in the Consulate, he had been shown as this sort of svelte, tallish figure with sort of leonine hair sort of blowing out behind his head, another type of fictional representation. But by 1812, this is kind of how he looked. But it's important to remember that the event, the thing that's being celebrated here is something from the Consulate. Beethoven, for instance, was a great admirer of Napoleon during the Consulate. But when Napoleon proclaimed the empire, reestablished titles of nobility, hereditary aristocratic succession, and all that kind of stuff, Beethoven turned on him. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, called the Eroica, was you may be familiar with, was originally dedicated to Napoleon, but Beethoven changed the dedication after the declaration of the empire. So a picture like this, which is in the National Gallery in Washington, one of the great Davids in this country, basically is using portraiture as a propaganda tool in favor of Napoleon. But the thing to remember is also the retrospective quality of this. This is basically a celebration of Napoleon before he was corrupted by power, which is what many people thought, moderates especially, thought was the reason why the empire was founded in the first place. David's great contemporary, and with David probably they were the two most famous artists in Europe, is the Italian sculptor Antonio Canova. Canova was a Venetian. He was a conservative, that is, he liked the old system, the old regime. He was a very, very devout Catholic, friend of Jesuits, a great admirer of Pope Pius VII, who was the pontiff during this period. But because of his great fame as a sculptor, Napoleon wanted to co-opt him. Now, it had been easy to get David. All he had to do is sort of lure a job, that is, painter to the first consul and then painter to the empire, to David, and David is happy to accept it because he had been so politically suspect and imprisoned off and on during the late 1790s. Canova was another issue. As a Venetian, Canova bitterly resented Bonaparte, Napoleon's, extinguishing the Venetian Republic, of which Canova was often proud. This statue of Napoleon as Mars the Peacemaker, which was done under duress and protest, actually is signed on the back of the base, Canova da Venezia. That is Canova from Venice. Again, this little dig about Napoleon having destroyed Canova's country. This commission came about in 1802 during the consulate. Canova was approached by Napoleon's ambassador to the Pope, in Rome in 1802, offered an enormous amount of money for the statue, but Napoleon tried everything he could to tempt Canova to come and set up his studio in Paris. He kept sending letters saying, "This is now the new capital. Rome is a backwater. Come here and your fame will redound to your glory." What Bonaparte really meant is that your fame will celebrate my glory in the visual arts, and Canova was not having any of it. It got so bad that the French ambassador finally told the Pope that if Canova did not go to Paris to make the first consul's portrait, that they would occupy Rome. This is the level of political and military drama that's going on, and it's certainly a testimony to Canova's tremendous fame. Napoleon simply could not have him, that is Canova, working outside of the consular and especially in the imperial system. Canova went to Paris in 1802. At first he delayed the trip saying, "Oh, the roads are bad, my housekeeper's sick, I'm not feeling so well myself, I have to wash my wig." Canova was bald and wore a French wig. It's the only French thing he actually liked. Anyway, but finally he went. And before he left, he made his will because he thought that Napoleon might force him to stay in Paris, and there he would get into political trouble. And since the French were really good at cutting people's heads off, Canova wasn't taking any chances. In 1802, during his time in Paris, he made a bust. I'm not showing that to you, but he made a bust of the first consul done in the ancient Roman style. And this bust was then used to create the portrait head for this colossal statue. It's almost 12 feet tall, so it's almost twice human scale. But the head of it is based on a small terracotta portrait bust of Napoleon that was done from the life. He went back to Rome after about 3 months, and he supposedly started working on the sculpture. In point of fact, he did virtually nothing. He delayed and delayed and delayed. The French ambassador kept coming to the studio to see what was going on, and some excuses and some modicum amount of work would be shown to him. But the crucial thing came in 1808 when the French army occupied Rome, not because of Canova, but because the Pope was not cooperating with Napoleon's program. Pope Pius VII was deposed and taken as a prisoner back to France, where he remained until 1814. This changed everything because now Canova was technically a French subject of the empire, and he finally finished the statue. Napoleon was so obsessed with this statue that he sent detailed instructions about how it was to be sent back to Paris. First of all, it was to be done by sea rather than across the mountains. And the crate that contained it, you can imagine what a job it would be even crating something this big and this heavy. Marble's very dense and heavy. He ordered that the crate be placed on the back of the ship where it could easily be pushed overboard if the British got a hold of it. If the British Navy was in pursuit of the ship that had the statue, he did not want it to fall in British hands. Back in 1802, when Canova was making the bust, he was talking to Napoleon about how Canova was going to represent him. Napoleon wanted to be represented in his uniform, like this, as a sort of a modern military hero. Canova said, "I don't work that way. That heroic nudity a la antique, that is in the antique fashion, is the only way that a hero should be represented." And as I'll talk about in just a minute, Canova had an agenda for saying that. So finally, Napoleon acquiesced, and nudity was the order of the day. By the time this thing arrived in Paris in early 1811, Napoleon was extremely nervous. The ship got through; it wasn't attacked or anything. So the statue arrived, and then it came up the Rhone to the Seine and was delivered to Paris and sent to the Louvre. Napoleon's first intention when he commissioned the statue was to set it up in the Louvre, which had been renamed the Musée Napoléon, the Napoleon Museum, and this had all the spoils of Rome, of Antwerp, the Flemish Baroque, all the artists we've studied in this class practically. Their masterpieces had been looted from all the places that the French had occupied, and they had been set up in the Louvre. And the idea of this statue being set in the middle of all the great antiquities, the Apollo Belvedere, the Laocoon, all of the other great works from the pontifical museums in Rome, It was to show Napoleon sort of in the light of an ancient hero, as a cultural liberator who had taken these statues from people who didn't appreciate them, paintings too, from people who didn't appreciate them, and set them up in the new Rome. That is, Paris is the new Rome in this particular equation. He took one look at it and sent it to a storage closet. He recognized the fact that he looked like this, and the statue looked like this. And if the French fear anything, it's ridicule. There's a long history in France of public ridicule of art that represents people in a sort of a grander fashion than they actually were. This statue, it could be seen by a few people by permission. David went to see it and admired it greatly. Some other artists saw it and a few sort of art-interested people, but the public was completely shut off from it. My argument is that mythological camouflage is what was used to depoliticize the most political figure in contemporary Europe at the time. The body itself is based on an ancient Greek warrior hero, also represented in the nude, that was one of the few sort of second-tier antiquities that was left in Rome. Sort of a little phrase went around saying that when the body is nude, the head will be but little regarded. Canova hated making portraits. He says it's beneath the dignity of a true artist, yet Napoleon demands a portrait. So there's a real separation between the kind of, it is idealized to a degree, but the head is recognizably Napoleon. But the body is something completely different. The fact that the nudity of the body is done in the manner of an ancient, it doesn't imitate any particular one thing or copy it, but it's inspired by ancient statuary of this sort of nude hero warrior type. Criticism of this was largely limited to details of the body. Almost no one commented on the head at all, except to say that it was an interesting, interesting portrait of the emperor. They talked about that the figure perhaps was too athletic for a hero. They mentioned that the iliac crest was perhaps a little bit too exaggerated. In other words, the aesthetic critique was based on the body, not the head, and that's exactly what Canova was looking for. Canova did not want to make a work for Napoleon, or for anybody else for that matter, in France at least, that would in any way it could be in any way used effectively as propaganda for the regime. This statue is one of the great white elephants in the history of art, and it has a certain, in terms of its provenance, this is borne out in certain important ways. You're looking at it here in Apsley House in London, which is where it still stands. If you come in from over here, this is the front door. We come in and you look immediately to the right. There's a staircase here, nice gilding, that goes up to the second floor. Apsley House is the London residence of the Duke of Wellington, who was the victor over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. In 1814, when Napoleon was overthrown, and the old Bourbon family, we'll talk about that a little bit later, and the old Bourbon family was brought back in the so-called Bourbon Restoration, they didn't want this statue. He was their archenemy. They hated him. Nobody else wanted it either. So finally, the British government purchased it from the French government for a sort of derisory amount of money and presented it almost as a war trophy to the Duke of Wellington. It's placed in this particular position in Apsley House. By the way, if you're going to Buckingham Palace to see the changing of the guard, this is just off the Green Park, so it's easy to go and visit. Anyway, it's placed here because the gilding of the staircase almost acts like a cage. In the old days, when Canova was not very well regarded as an artist, the staff of Apsley used to chain their bicycles to Napoleon's legs, and you can still see in the marbles some of the striations and marks that kind of abuse actually left. The conceit of Napoleon as Mars the peacemaker is also oxymoronic, because the way he made peace was through war. He's shown here in one hand an enormous spear that has a gilt tip that we can't see in this particular image, and in his right hand he's holding a gilt orb that represents the world, with a winged figure in gilt bronze of Nike, the Greek goddess of victory, like Nike shoes. It's the same type of goddess. So in any way, war has brought him victory and universal dominion. This is the conceit of the statue. The idea was clearly Canova's because he wanted to emphasize as much as possible mythological aspects of the iconography, which would take away from Napoleon as the great hero, at least as much as was possible. And in terms of the criticism, this worked too, because people talked a lot more about Nike than they talked about Napoleon's head. I've compared this, else in print, to the idea of one of these beach strongmen, where you have the body of sort of a bodybuilder and all that, with sort of the beautiful woman under one arm and the little tiny, shorts and all this kind of stuff, and then you stick your head on it and you have your photograph made. That's sort of what this is like. The head is almost completely disassembled or dismembered from the body. They're considered on two different levels. So mythological camouflage then, by calling this Napoleon as Mars, the god of war, and as peacemaker with victory and Nike in his hands, as a conceit, complicates the iconography of this to a considerable degree. And mythology then helps to camouflage the political implications of it, to sort of kind of keep them as minimal as possible as you can in a recognizable portrait of Napoleon. Nudity also undermined the idea of this being any kind of propagandistic sculpture. If he'd been shown in his military uniform, that would have been Napoleon, the great war hero. By making him nude, again, if the body is nude, the face will be but little regarded. So Canova, by using mythological camouflage, removed it from the political and propagandistic intentions of the patron towards considerations of aesthetics that concerned him as an artist, and that's how he dealt with critics who were talking about the statue and its various virtues and various faults. This was actually a brilliant strategy. Canova outlived the empire and all of that, and his later works are almost exclusively church works. He built a great monument church that became his own tomb north of Venice. He did a lot to help restore all of the works that Napoleon had stolen from the Louvre. He went back to Paris in 1814 and 1815 and repatriated most of the major things that the French had stolen. And that's why when we see the Apollo Belvedere, it's in Rome. When we see Raphael's Transfiguration, which we talked about earlier, it was in Paris too. It's back in Rome. So this repatriation is part of the broader cultural project of Canova. He becomes, in that sense, a kind of an art ambassador who significantly helped not only the Italians, but all the other European countries whose works and their cultural patrimony that have been stolen by the French. A simile portrait of this type, that is Napoleon as Mars the Peacemaker, has a long tradition, not only in European art, but particularly in French art. And I think that's one of the reasons why this mythological disguise or guise for Napoleon was chosen. It's another one of these distancing devices from a pure portrait. And the simile then, as comparing two things, Napoleon and Mars, are compared in this particular way. It's not Napoleon as peacemaker in the guise of Mars, but he wants Mars right in the same simile, Napoleon as Mars, because he wants to emphasize him as a warrior, as a god of war, rather than this sort of conquering, victorious, magnanimous, benign ruler of Europe, which is the image that Napoleon wished to express about himself. In this particular case, it did not work. One of Napoleon's strategies for dominating Europe was when he would occupy and conquer different countries, political entities, kingdoms, duchies, archduchies, even republics, like in the case of Venice. What he would do in order to control them would be to appoint his brothers and sisters, and there were a whole passel of them. There were lots and lots of Bonapartes running around. He had 3 brothers and 5 sisters, and he made them all kings and queens and duchesses of various types of places. In other words, he thought that by placing his siblings on the vacated thrones of Europe, vacated because he had sort of driven out the previous occupants, that this would be a way of extending the Bonaparte family's dynastic ambitions to control all of Europe. This was ultimately his goal. Britain and Russia were the 2 nuts that proved ultimately impossible to crack. His sister Caroline, who was the smartest of the group and the most morally corrupt of the group, she and her husband, Murat, you not to know him, but he was one of Napoleon's generals who had married his sister, they were made king and queen of Naples in 1808. She lasted, because of her wits, until 1815, when her husband betrayed the Allies. He had gone over from Napoleon to the Allies in 1814. He went back to Napoleon. He was shot in 1815, and she was deposed as queen, and the old Bourbons who used to rule in Naples were restored at that particular point. Queen Caroline had a very interesting form of art patronage. She was especially interested in a phenomenon called Turquerie. This French word is hard, Turkey-ish, I suppose, but you should leave it in the French because it makes more sense that way. Was basically one of these sort of exoticisms like chinoiserie for China, or Espagnolism for interest in Spain, or Russamanie, the Russian mania. These peripheral areas of Europe and then distant lands like the Islamic Near East and particularly East Asia. During the 18th century, as we've seen with Boucher, these kinds of exoticisms were very popular as a way of embracing certain aspects of foreign culture, but completely seen through a French lens. The painting I'm showing you here on the screen is a very good example of Turquerie and of the kinds of things that Queen Caroline Bonaparte of Naples liked to commission. It's by an artist named Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who was one of David's pupils and is the leading classicizing painter of the first half of the 19th century. As we'll see a little later, he is contrasted with the Romantics. So there's Ingres on the classical side, and then, as we'll see later, Delacroix and Géricault on the Romantic side. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. This painting is called Le Grand Odalisque. It was painted in 1814. Unfortunately for Caroline, and in some ways unfortunately for Ingres, Caroline was in such terrible political trouble in 1814 and 1815 that she couldn't pay for the picture. So she never saw it. It was painted in Paris, but it never actually came to Naples. And in point of fact, it was in Ingres' studio when he died I think it's 1867, and he lived a very, very long time, well into the 19th century. An odalisque is a girl of the harem, and harem culture was incredibly interesting in France and had been for a long time. Harem pants, these sort of tight-fitting silk type of, or satin type of knee breeches that came right below the knee, were very fashionable for women. Women began wearing turbans of the type you see here in the odalisque, who's sort of looking at us over her shoulder. An odalisque then, as an object of desire in a harem type of setting, is incredibly titillating. I mean, harems existed in North Africa. This was part of Islamic culture, where wealthy men and rulers were able to keep sort of many women as just sort of in an enclosed space for his personal pleasure whenever he got around to it. Sultans in Turkey, for instance, and emirs and caliphs in some of the North African countries and in Syria, their harems often had over 100 women at a particular time. And as some aged out, new ones would be brought in. These women are slaves. I mean, they're not free to go. As a matter of fact, they're kept under lock and key by eunuch servants. And we'll see a very famous example of one of these by Delacroix, painted in the 1830s of a North African harem in Algiers that has a very prominently displayed eunuch black male who's in charge of the harem. I mean, if this is your interest, you certainly don't want any intact males in there because, you know, things happen that you might not actually like. The odalisque then represents this interest in Turkish stuff, Turquerie, the harem, tobacco, smoking hashish. You look over here on the right and you see that she's been snorting on a hookah. Here's the opium, or probably some other kind of narcotic, hashish or something like that, but opium was smoked in this way too. Here's the nozzle of it. It's not going to take her much to sort of take a big puff. You can imagine how boring life in a harem must have been for these women, so the idea of keeping them in this sort of narcotic stupor makes a whole lot of sense. But it was also true that in France by the 19th century, people were using hookahs and smoking different kinds of narcotic drugs as a form of sort of recreational entertainment. She's holding an a peacock feather fan. You can see the peacock eyes in the feathers here. She's wearing bracelets and this very beautiful plaid turban with tassels on the back of it. The overall color scheme is blue and gold, which is one of Aang's favorite color forms of juxtaposition. The thing, though, two things about the Grand Odalisque that are important to consider. One of these is that as a classicizing, conservative, neoclassical artist, Aang was very, very much interested in Raphael back from the High Renaissance, and we talked about the School of Athens, the Disputa, the Madonna of the Meadows, and the Transfiguration. To Aang, Raphael represented the pinnacle of achievement in Western painting. So imitation of Raphael is basically the way one does good art. If you look at the head here, which is half in shadow, it's remarkably like a lot of female figures in Raphael paintings, none that we actually saw except maybe the Madonna head. It has this kind of, it's drawn almost like in an ovoid form with a compass. There's an idealization about it that definitely harkens back to Raphael. But there the resemblance ends. What you see here is a distorted form, a female form, that has no relationship to the natural body of a woman. The female body in French art, especially in French art, during the 17th and 18th century and into the 19th century, was an ungoverned country in terms of academic rules. The male body was strictly controlled. Artists in studios at the Academy and elsewhere would go in and they would draw after the posed male model. You had to master the sinews, the tendons, the anatomy, the muscle structure. That's why the bodies were posed often in sort of difficult things for the models to maintain for very long, because you're trying to stress different kind of muscle groups. A male body drawn out of drawing, as they call it, that is where something isn't quite right or doesn't work well, muscles, bones, and things like that, is a way to get your career sort of scuttled or torpedoed before it even begins. The female body was different. Female models were not posed in studios, in academies, or anywhere else. If a male artist wanted to sketch a female body, he had to either hire a prostitute, employ his mistress, or something else. This allowed artists to be creative. And this body is incredibly creative in terms of naturalistic anatomy. One art historian who didn't have enough to do actually counted her vertebrae and came up with the number 43. Now I was absent that day in anatomy class in high school or whatever, but clearly it does look like the spine is way, way, way too long. Her right breast seems to be growing out of her armpit, which is not the kind of thing you would actually want to do. How in the world she got her left leg in that position is impossible to tell. And look at the bottom of her right foot. In other words, Aang knows how to draw a body. It's not that he is doing this because he doesn't know any better. What he's doing is taking the female body, and instead of a naturalistic woman, female figure, he is presenting the woman as a confection. In other words, her linearity. Look at the beautiful curve of her head. Down the tassels indicate this on the turban, where it curves around in this extremely voluptuous way. The nudity is in many ways explicitly sinuous, but it's not terribly sensual. I mean, this is not erotic in the way one would normally think of the female body being done in this particular way. She becomes then a part of a composition. She is a work of art, not a work of nature. And this idea permeates classicizing art when it represents and deals with the female body throughout the 19th century. is actually the kind of thing that realist and impressionist artists revolted against in the middle of the century. One only has to think of Monet's Olympia, which we will see in due course. If you know that picture, fine. But it's a real woman's body, unlike what we're looking at here. So the Grand Odalisque not only shows neoclassical, or classicizing maybe better, attitudes towards the female body, it also shows contemporary European interest in the theme of the harem and in contemporary Islamic culture in this trickery mode. Okay, as I mentioned, this was commissioned by Queen Caroline in 1814. She was, because of the political collapse of Napoleon's empire, she wasn't able to pay for it or accept delivery, so it remained with Ang in his studio until he died. What happened in 1814 was, of course, the empire ended. Napoleon abdicated the French throne and was sent into exile. His first exile in 1814 was on the little island of Elba off the Italian coast of Tuscany, and it gave rise to the greatest palindrome in history. That is, able was I ere I saw Elba, which basically is spelled the same way in both directions, which is what a palindrome is. That's for your cocktail party amusement. But in 1815 he escaped from Elba and came back to France, raised an army, and Murat, Queen Caroline's husband, joined up. They were defeated at Waterloo, and Murat was shot. And that end of the Napoleonic regime everywhere, and especially in Naples. Then the Bourbon family was brought back. These are the two Bourbon kings, 1814 to 1830, who were Louis XVI's younger brothers. One of them was Louis XVIII, so called because Louis XVII, Louis XVI's son, died mysteriously in prison during the Revolution. So his brother, Louis XVIII, became king. And then, important for us, Charles X, the youngest brother of all of Louis XVI, became king in 1824. Charles X, last reigning Bourbon monarch, after 1830 they finally got rid of him. I don't know what took so long, but anyway. 1830, Charles X was deposed during a revolution that celebrated, as we shall see in Delacroix's, liberty leading the people. That's about the end and the overthrow of the Bourbons. But from 1814 to 1830, and especially from 1824 to 1830, during the reign of Charles X, this was a period of incredible reaction against not only the revolution, but against Bonaparte. Charles X was deeply authoritarian and is what was called an ultra-conservative, not just a conservative, but an ultra-conservative. He reestablished the Catholic Church in all of its power and glory. He did everything he could to seize lands that had belonged to aristocrats and to the church before the Revolution of 1789 and to return them to their original owners, dispossessing, of course, the bourgeoisie that had bought these properties during the Revolution and certainly during the Consulate and the Empire. Charles X then represented this sort of ultra-conservative point of view, and he also manifested this artistically. Ang was also an ultra-conservative person politically, deeply pious like Canova, dedicated to the church, and perfectly willing to serve this kind, at least in culture, this kind of ultra-conservative agenda. The picture we're looking at here is called The Apotheosis of Homer, and it dates 1827. This was a commission to Ang from Charles X. It's a large picture. It is several times bigger than the image that you're looking at, though I know that the scale must be distorted in this particular type of thing, but think about the classroom. It's much bigger than what would have been projected on the screen. And it was originally supposed to be set into a ceiling, so we would be looking up at it. I think Charles X's idea is that this is sort of a manifesto of sorts, and that we should be looking up at it as if we're seeing some sort of heavenly apparition. In the end, it was not displayed on the ceiling. It was displayed dominating an entire wall. But this work is a very good example of the idea of a cultural conservative manifesto. Manifesto in 1827, of course, is an anachronistic term because this word doesn't come into usage until the very end of the 19th century. But even if they didn't use the word manifesto, manifesto is what really describes this. It's in many ways a sort of an imaginary view of all of the great cultural heroes of the conservative classical tradition in Europe. You see in the middle here, seated on the throne, is the ancient Greek poet Homer here. He is being crowned by fame with a laurel crown. Remember Apollo and laurels and all that kind of stuff with Apollo and Daphne. This is a symbol of poetic triumph. He's all this angelic type of figure. It's really a genius of fame. Is also holding a frond, which is a symbol in this case of a man who becomes a god. That's what an apotheosis actually is. He's seated here in a very frontal way, right on the central axis. Look at how even this architectural ornament at the top of the pediment of this Ionic temple comes right down through his body. On the basis, on the sort of the base of this pedestal on which he's seated here in this manner where he's enthroned, are two female personifications of the Iliad here, shown with a sword, and the Odyssey here, shown with a paddle, because the Odyssey is about the sea voyage back from Troy to Greece after the Greeks had defeated the Trojans. So just like Raphael, you've got this pyramidal composition that stabilizes the center, and then groups of figures going off to the left and groups of figures going off to the right in the manner of an ancient frieze sculpture. And we talked about this idea before. The figures who are shown standing here and here are all the great cultural worthies and glories of the classical tradition. And it's interesting, Homer is the oldest of them all. That's the original source of great literature in the Western tradition. One of the underlying principles of a picture like this is that the older it is, the better it is. How much more ultra-conservative can you get than that? And in the groups, the closer you are to Homer, the more likely you are to eventually, in another 1,000 years or so, you're going to be apotheosized as well. So he becomes the model for emulation of cultural figures. I'll just point out a few of them here. Holding up this lyre is the Greek poet Pindar. Right behind him is Sophocles and Aristophanes over here, that is great Greek playwrights. On the left side, you have Echinus and Callicrates, who are the architects of the Parthenon. Again, old Greek stuff. Greek's better than Roman because Roman's more recent. You move back a little bit, and you see a figure here of the Roman playwright Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. So we're now moving away from Homer, but we're still in ancient times. Here is Aeneas. Right behind him is the painter Raphael. He's farther away because he, although great and classical and glorious and all of that, he is still part of a more modern type of tradition. But the figures that are most interesting in this are the ones we see that seem to be emerging from the stone, from the marble steps here on the left and on the right. These are the people who are even more modern. For instance, right here is Nicolas Poussin, the great French classical painter. He's still too young. He's only like 250 years old or so, so we can't really have him standing full length. He's accompanied by Sir Isaac Newton, an Englishman who is here. And right here on the left-hand side, cut off, and this is not an accident, the painting actually cuts him off here, this is William Shakespeare. Because William Shakespeare was admired for his classical plays, like Julius Caesar and Coriolanus. But he also wrote these kind of dark, brooding, romantic type of things like Hamlet and Macbeth. So he's in this sort of ambiguous limbo, half in and half out. Over here on the right, you see the two, here and here, you see the two great classicists of the French tradition, Molière and Racine, the great sort of gods of French drama from the late 17th century. So the whole thing of the apotheosis of Homer is basically a celebration of ultra-conservative culture. The kinds of things that were to be imitated, emulated, and admired. As we'll see next time, when I hope to see you in person on November 6th, when we resume our regular schedule of lectures, I'll talk about an artist named Géricault, who is the father of the Romantic tradition, died young and in tragic circumstances. Ingres was the only painter, the only major artist who refused to contribute to a fund to pay for a monument to Géricault. He said this is how politicized this idea had become between classical art and romantic art. But I'm anticipating that argument. But remember this picture when I talk about the Raft of the Medusa and Géricault's achievement. Because of Ingres' hostility, you really see what's at stake. It's not just two artistic styles competing, it's two cultural ideologies in conflict with one another for supremacy. And this battle goes on well into the second half of the 19th century.